The world had dissolved into a monochromatic watercolor of gray and green. 1 minute, I was following a well-trod shepherd's path through the Romanian Carpathians. The next, a silent, pearlescent mist had rolled down from the peaks like a shroud, swallowing everything. The ancient beech trees, their bark like the skin of aged elephants, became indistinct giants looming in the periphery. The silence was the most unsettling part. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of the wilderness. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that muted the world, broken only by the snap of a twig under my hiking boots, a sound that seemed obscenely loud in the stillness. As an amateur historian, I'd come here chasing ghosts of a different sort. The echoes of medieval princedoms and crumbling Dacian fortresses. I had not expected the landscape itself to become the adversary. I pulled out my compass, a reliable old Silva I'd owned for years. The needle spun lazily, then quivered, pointing southeast, then northwest, as if utterly bewildered. A cold knot of dread tightened in my stomach. I checked my phone. No signal. The GPS app was just a blank grid with a single blinking blue dot lost in a sea of nothing. I was officially, profoundly lost. The mist was getting thicker, clinging to my jacket in cold, damp beads. The temperature had dropped at least 15 degrees, and the air carried a chill that felt older than winter, a deep earth coldness. Anxiety began to prickle at the edges of my focus. I was alone, miles from any known town, with failing equipment and a storm brewing in the featureless sky above the fog. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into a watching shape, every rustle of leaves a footfall. Hours bled into one another. My confident stride devolved into a weary, stumbling shuffle. Thirst was a rasp in my throat, and the energy bars in my pack felt a world away. Just as the gray light began to fail, turning the mist into a bruised purple, I stumbled out of the tree line and stopped dead. Below me, nestled in a small, impossibly green valley, was a village. It wasn't on any of my maps, modern or historical. It was a perfect, anachronistic jewel. The houses were dark timber and whitewashed plaster, with steep shingled roofs. Yet they showed no signs of age or decay. There were no power lines, no satellite dishes, but as dusk settled, gas lamps flickered to life along the cobblestone street, casting a warm, buttery glow that seemed entirely out of place. It was like stepping into a meticulously maintained museum piece. Drawn by a mixture of exhaustion and profound curiosity, I made my way down the slope. As I got closer, I heard it. The murmur of voices, laughter, and the faint, lilting strains of a string quartet. In the center of the village, a small square had been turned into some kind of festival. A crowd of people, 50 or 60 at least, were gathered around a makeshift stage. I recognized the brands on their clothes: North Face, Columbia, Patagonia. They were tourists just like me. I saw a German couple I'd briefly met at a hostel 2 days ago, a group of Japanese students with expensive cameras, and a boisterous family from Texas. They were all smiling, captivated by a troupe of performers on the stage dressed in lavish medieval garb, acting out some kind of folkloric play. The whole scene was surreal, a pocket of warmth and life in the heart of this oppressive wilderness. From the edge of the crowd, a figure detached itself and moved toward me. He was tall and unnaturally thin, dressed in the severe black livery of a majordomo, complete with white gloves. His movements were liquid and precise, but there was a subtle stiffness to them, like a marionette trying to pass for human. A smile was fixed on his pale face, but it was a mask. It didn't reach the cold, dark pools of his eyes. "Welcome, traveler," he said. his voice a smooth, unaccented English that was itself a strange thing to hear in this remote corner of the world. "You have arrived at a most fortuitous time." He gestured not just at me, but at the other recent arrivals I could now see trickling out of the woods from different directions, all wearing the same expressions of weary relief and confusion. He waited for a lull in the applause from the crowd before raising his voice, projecting it with an effortless clarity that cut through the evening air. "Honored guests," he announced, his smile widening a fraction. "My master, the esteemed Lord Valyrias, is overjoyed to see so many new faces grace his domain. As is his annual tradition, he extends an invitation to you all. A masquerade ball is to be held this evening in his castle." He gestured with one gloved hand toward the cliffs that loomed over the village. There, perched on a crag of black rock like a roosting vulture, was a castle. Its Gothic spires and crenellated towers clawed at the darkening sky, a silhouette of jagged stone against the swirling mist. "There will be a feast, wine, and spectacle the likes of which you have never seen. All are welcome." A murmur of excitement rippled through the tourists. Free food, a warm place to stay, and a story to tell for the rest of their lives. Who could resist? I felt a tremor of unease, a historian's instinct screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. A hidden village? A lost lord? A sudden festival for stranded tourists? It was the beginning of a dozen different grim folk tales. But my stomach growled, my muscles ached, and the thought of a hot meal and a glass of wine was an almost irresistible siren's call. The German man clapped me on the shoulder. Incredible, yes? What luck! The Texan family was already herding their kids toward the path, the father booming about authentic local culture. Logic fought a losing battle with exhaustion and desire. I was cold, hungry, and lost. This was a lifeline. I fell in step with the others, a mismatched flock following the silent, gliding majordomo. We began our ascent up the winding stone path that led to the castle, leaving the warm, deceptive light of the village below. With every step, the air grew colder, and the mist seemed to curl around the castle's towers, as if the fortress itself was breathing, slowly, patiently, drawing us into its stone lungs. The great oak doors of the castle groaned open, and we stepped from the cold, misty night into the cavernous expanse of the grand ballroom. The sheer scale of the place was breathtaking. A vaulted ceiling soared 50 feet above us, supported by ribbed stone columns that looked like the petrified skeletons of ancient leviathans. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax from 1,000 candles burning in wrought iron chandeliers, the dry perfume of dust from ages past, and an undertone that was both sweet and cloying, like flowers left to decay in a sealed room. My historian's eye drank in the details. The Gothic architecture was flawless, a masterpiece of the 15th century. But the decorations were unsettling. Magnificent tapestries covered the stone walls, depicting vivid, chaotic scenes. At first glance, they looked like classic medieval hunts. But as I looked closer, my blood ran cold. The hunters were not men. They were hulking, wolf-like beasts and winged humanoid figures, and their prey, fleeing in terror through the woven forests, were unmistakably human. The hall was already filled with guests, a silent, swirling kaleidoscope of color and costume. They wore elaborate masks, plague doctors with long beaks, Venetian jesters with bells and grinning faces, animal masks with feathers and fur. A live orchestra, tucked away in a shadowed alcove, played a haunting, hypnotic melody. It was a waltz, but it was filled with discordant notes and a rhythm that felt just slightly off. like a frantic heartbeat struggling to find a steady pace. At the entrance, the major domo and several footmen offered us masks from silver trays. I chose a simple black domino mask, feeling the cool press of it against my skin as a strange sense of anonymity settled over me. Servants in the same severe livery as our guide moved through the crowd with a predatory grace, their movements silent and efficient. They carried trays laden with the most exquisite food I had ever seen. Glistening roasted birds, pastries filled with dark berries, cheeses of every shape and color, and delicate, shimmering jellies. Crystal goblets were kept filled with a deep, ruby wine. Having not eaten a proper meal all day, I accepted a glass without hesitation. The wine was rich and warming, with a complex, spicy flavor that spread a pleasant heat through my limbs. I took another glass and then another. A lightheaded, euphoric feeling washed over me, dulling the edges of my earlier anxiety. Around me, the other tourists were doing the same, laughing and eating with a ravenous hunger, their initial awe giving way to giddy celebration. But as the initial euphoria from the wine began to fade, replaced by a strange, sharpened awareness, I started to notice things. The old guests, the ones who were here when we arrived, never removed their masks. Not once. They didn't eat, they didn't drink, and they didn't speak to each other. They simply drifted through the ballroom, their masked faces turning slowly, observing us newcomers with an unnerving, silent intensity. The servants, too, seemed wrong. As they passed, I caught their gazes from beneath their lowered lashes. Their eyes were not just deferential. They were assessing, like butchers inspecting livestock. The sweet smell in the air seemed stronger now, and I finally placed it. It was the smell of lilies, the funereal scent of decay trying to hide itself under a blanket of perfume. Suddenly, the music screeched to a halt. A profound silence fell over the ballroom, so abrupt and total it was like a physical blow. Every head, masked and unmasked, turned toward the grand staircase that swept up to a balcony overlooking the hall. The major domo appeared at the top of the stairs, his posture ramrod straight. "My lords, ladies, and honored guests," his voice boomed, imbued with a chilling resonance. "Your host, the master of this house, Lord Valyrias," all eyes fixed on the balcony. A figure emerged from the shadows. He was tall, dressed in a magnificent doublet of black velvet and blood-red silk. But it was his face, or the thing that served as his face, that made the breath catch in my throat. It was a hideous, asymmetrical ruin, a landscape of melted-looking flesh, waxy and pale, with ridges of bone pushing through the skin at unnatural angles. One side of his mouth was pulled up in a permanent, lipless sneer. Yet, set deep within this ruin were two eyes that burned with a terrifying, ancient intelligence. They swept across the crowd below, filled with a potent mixture of utter contempt and absolute power. A collective gasp went through the tourists, quickly followed by scattered, appreciative applause. "Incredible effects," a woman next to me whispered to her husband. "Looks so real." But it didn't look like an effect. It looked like a nightmare given form. Then two more figures emerged from the darkness to stand on either side of him. One was a hulking creature covered in coarse black fur, with the powerful legs and hunched posture of an ape, but the long, snarling muzzle and pointed ears of a wolf. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent red light. The other was tall and impossibly slender, wrapped in what looked like a cloak of shadows, until it shifted, and I saw the cloak was actually a pair of vast, leathery, bat-like wings folded against its back. As the tourists applauded louder, thinking it all part of a spectacular show, a third thing slithered into view beside Valyrias, a glistening, amorphous horror with a cluster of writhing tentacles where a head should be. I felt a primal cold seize my heart, a certainty that sank into my bones like ice. This was not a performance. These were not costumes. We had not been invited to a party. We had been lured into a cage. Lord Valyrias raised a pale, long-fingered hand, and the smattering of applause from the tourist contingent died instantly. The silence that returned was heavier than before, charged with a new and terrible anticipation. He leaned forward against the balcony's stone railing, his burning eyes sweeping over us, the unmasked and naive, lingering on each face for a fraction of a second, as if committing it to memory. When he spoke, his voice was a deep, resonant bass that seemed to vibrate not in the air, but directly inside my skull. It was a voice accustomed to absolute command, layered with centuries of aristocratic arrogance. "Welcome," he purred, the sound both cultured and predatory. "Welcome to my home. I am Valyrias. I thank you all for accepting my invitation. It has been some time since we have had such a vibrant and varied collection of guests." A low chuckle rumbled in his chest, a dry, rasping sound like stones grinding together. "You have eaten my food. You have drunk my wine. Now, it is time for the evening's true entertainment to commence." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, savoring the confused and curious expressions on the faces below. Some of the tourists were grinning, eagerly awaiting the next part of the show. The man in the garish Hawaiian shirt next to me, who I'd later learn was named Mark, nudged his friend. "Here we go, man. This is going to be epic." "In my family," Valyrias continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone, "we have a tradition. An ancient and sacred game that honors the spirit of this land, the spirit of predator and prey. We call it the Great Hunt." He spread his hands wide, a gesture of grand generosity that was utterly negated by the cruel sneer on his mangled face. "And tonight, you, my cherished guests, have been chosen to play the most vital role." He leaned further over the railing, his intelligent eyes gleaming. "The rules are elegantly simple. You," he said, pointing a single sharp finger down at us, the group of tourists, "are the quarry. My loyal household," he gestured to the silent, masked figures and the graceful servants, "are the hunters. This castle and its grounds are the field. You have 24 hours. Survive until the dawn of the second day, and you will have proven yourself worthy." A few nervous laughs broke the silence. A young woman called out, "What's the prize?" Valyrias's sneer deepened into a grotesque semblance of a smile. "Ah, the prize." He savored the word. "The prize is a gift beyond your mortal comprehension. For the one who endures, who proves their strength and cunning, I will bestow a gift I reserve for only the most deserving. I will grant you a share of my own power. I will give you eternity." The tourists were still processing the words, their minds trying to fit this bizarre speech into the context of a theatrical game. But I saw the shift in the servants' postures. I saw the way the masked guests turned as one to face us. The air grew thick, electric with menace. This wasn't a game. It was a declaration. Valyrias straightened up, his form radiating an immense and terrifying authority. He raised his hand high above his head. For a heart-stopping moment, the castle was utterly still. Then he let his hand fall. Somewhere in the depths of the castle, a massive gong was struck. The sound was not merely loud, it was a physical force, a deep bronze boom that slammed into us, vibrating through the stone floor, up my legs, and into the marrow of my bones. It was a sound of finality, a sound of doom. And as the last echoes of the gong faded, the transformation began. The footman nearest me suddenly screamed, a high, piercing shriek of inhuman agony. He dropped his silver tray with a deafening clatter and fell to his knees, his body convulsing violently. I watched in frozen paralytic horror as his bones broke and reformed under his skin with sickening wet cracks and snaps. His spine arched backward, his limbs elongated, and coarse gray fur erupted from his flesh, tearing through his fine livery. His face pushed forward into a snarling lupine muzzle, his teeth lengthening into wicked yellow fangs as saliva dripped onto the marble floor. Within 10 seconds, the man was gone, replaced by a 7-foot-tall monster of muscle and fur, a werewolf, ripped straight from the darkest of fireside tales. All around the room, the same horrific metamorphosis was taking place. The graceful servants, the silent footmen, all of them were writhing on the floor, their human forms shredding away to reveal the slavering beasts beneath. Terror finally broke the spell of disbelief among the tourists. Screams erupted, a chorus of pure animal panic. The orchestra began to play again, the same hypnotic off-key waltz, now a macabre soundtrack to a bloodbath. The newly formed werewolves rose to their full height, shook their massive heads, and let out a symphony of guttural howls. Then they fell upon the nearest tourists. The first victim was the woman who had asked about the prize. A werewolf seized her, its claws sinking into her shoulders, and its jaws closed around her throat. Her scream was cut short with a sickening, wet crunch. The red waltz had begun. Blood sprayed across the marble floor in arterial fountains, painting the elegant ballroom in shades of crimson. The air filled with the sounds of tearing flesh, snapping bone, and the agonized cries of the dying, all set against that maddening, relentless music. For a second I was rooted to the spot, my mind unable to process the sheer visceral horror of it. Then the werewolf that had been a footman turned its yellow eyes on me. Survival instinct, raw and absolute, kicked in. I broke from my trance and ran. Along with a handful of others, including the loud guy, Mark, and a quiet, terrified-looking man in glasses, I sprinted for the nearest archway, away from the carnage, our panicked footsteps echoing the frantic, discordant rhythm of the dance of death behind us. Panic is a pure and terrible engine. It shuts down everything but the primal need to move, to get away. We ran, a small, terrified herd of 4. Myself, Mark in his now ludicrously out-of-place Hawaiian shirt, a quiet programmer type named David, who clutched a useless tablet to his chest like a shield, and a young woman I didn't know. The howls and snarls of the werewolves echoed behind us, amplified by the stone corridors, sounding like they were right on our heels. The castle was a labyrinth of vaulted hallways, lit by the unsteady flicker of torches that cast long, dancing shadows, turning every corner into a potential ambush. "This way," Mark yelled, pointing to a heavy oak door set deep in an alcove. There was no time to think or choose. We threw our combined weight against it. It wasn't locked. We scrambled inside, slamming the massive door shut just as the sound of claws scrabbling on stone reached us from the hallway. David fumbled with a heavy iron bolt and slid it home. For a moment we leaned against the door, chests heaving, sucking in ragged breaths of air. We were safe for now. When I finally turned to take in our surroundings, a wave of vertigo washed over me. We were in a vast octagonal chamber, and every single surface, the walls, the floor, the vaulted ceiling, was covered in mirrors. Hundreds of them, of every shape and size. Some were perfectly flat and modern, others were convex, distorting our reflections into grotesque caricatures. Many were old and clouded, the silvering peeling away like sunburnt skin, reflecting ghostly, indistinct images. Our small group was multiplied into an infinite silent army of frightened people, stretching away into a disorienting crystalline void. The only solid object in the entire room was a thick central pillar, also sheathed in a mosaic of mirrored shards. A deep guttural scratch sounded from the other side of the door. Then another, followed by a low, frustrated growl. It was testing the barrier. "We have to hide," I whispered, the sound unnaturally loud in the mirrored silence. My voice seemed to come from all directions at once. We scurried behind the central pillar, pressing ourselves flat against its cool, reflective surface, trying to make ourselves small. The scratching stopped. It was replaced by a heavy, rhythmic thud. Thump, thump, thump. The monster was using its body as a battering ram. The ancient oak door groaned, and with a final explosive crack of splintering wood, it burst inward. A massive gray werewolf stormed into the room. It stood there for a moment, head cocked, its yellow eyes scanning the hall. It seemed momentarily confused by the endless reflections, its own savage visage staring back at it from 1,000 different angles. It let out a low snarl, its breath fogging the mirrors near the doorway. It took a tentative step forward, then another, its claws clicking on the mirrored floor. It began to move around the perimeter of the room, using the reflections to its advantage, peering around corners that didn't exist, its head swiveling as it tried to distinguish the real from the reflected. We held our breath. A quartet of statues behind the pillar. I could feel David trembling beside me. The tension was unbearable. The silence was broken only by the creature's low growls and the sound of its claws on the floor. Mark, I could see, was not built for this kind of nerve-shredding stillness. His eyes were wide, darting from reflection to reflection. He was sweating profusely, his knuckles white where he gripped his own arms. He looked at a doorway on the opposite side of the room, a dark rectangle of hope in this glittering trap. I saw the decision flicker in his eyes a second before he acted. He was going to make a break for it. "Don't," I mouthed silently, but it was too late. Mark exploded from behind the pillar, his sneakers squeaking on the polished floor as he sprinted for the far door. It was a fatal mistake. The werewolf didn't see him directly. It saw his movement in one of the large, convex mirrors on the wall. The distorted reflection showed a squat, panicked figure running. The beast didn't hesitate. It launched itself across the room in a blur of gray fur and muscle, a truly terrifying display of speed and power. It covered the 30-foot distance in less than 2 seconds. Its leap was perfectly timed, intercepting Mark halfway to the door. We watched, horrified, as the scene was replayed in every mirror around us. 100 different angles of the same brutal slaughter. The werewolf's claws, each the size of a steak knife, tore through Mark's back. Its jaws clamped down on his shoulder, and we heard the sickening crunch of bone. He screamed, a raw, piercing sound that was abruptly cut off as the beast shook him violently, like a dog with a rat. From our hiding spot, we saw it all. We saw it in perfect clarity. We saw it warped and twisted. We saw it in clouded, ghostly fragments. The sheer, repetitive violence of it, reflected into infinity, was a horror my mind could barely contain. The young woman beside me let out a choked sob, which she quickly stifled with her hand. The werewolf dropped Mark's mangled body to the floor, its attention completely consumed by its kill. This was our chance. Its back was to us, its hulking form obscuring the direct line of sight to the far door. "Now," I whispered to David and the woman. "Go now." While the beast was bent over its gruesome meal, We slipped from behind the pillar. We moved as quietly as we could, our own terrified faces watching us from all sides. We reached the door Mark had died trying to get to, pulled it open, and slipped through, not daring to look back at the carnage multiplied 1,000 times in the Hall of Reflections. The door clicked shut behind us, plunging us into a starkly different environment. The disorienting, glittering chaos of the mirror hall was gone, replaced by a profound and unnerving silence. We were in what appeared to be a vast study or collection room. The air was dry and still, smelling of old paper and cedar. Towering shelves, at least 20 feet high, lined every wall from the floor to the coffered ceiling, each one crammed with objects. But these weren't books. My eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering in from a high, grimy window, and I realized what we were seeing. Dolls. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of them. They were of every conceivable type and era. Porcelain ladies in elaborate lace-trimmed gowns and tiny kid-leather gloves sat frozen in silent tea parties. Grinning, red-lipped clowns with ruffled collars and pointed hats lay limp on their shelves, their painted smiles seeming more like grimaces in the gloom. Wooden marionettes with slack strings hung from hooks, their limbs dangling at unnatural angles. There were simple, button-eyed rag dolls, and stern-faced nutcracker soldiers standing in rigid formation. They sat, stood, and lay in every available space, a silent, watchful congregation, and every single one of them, with their unblinking glass-painted or button eyes, seemed to be staring directly at us. The woman who had been with us, whose name I still didn't know, let out a soft whimper. "I hate dolls," she breathed. The room was utterly still. The sounds of the hunt, the howls, and the screams were muffled and distant here. It felt like a sanctuary, albeit a deeply creepy one. David, ever the pragmatist, immediately began searching for another exit, moving cautiously between the towering shelves. I followed his lead, my own eyes scanning the walls of silent observers, a primal, irrational fear prickling my skin. It felt as if we had stumbled into a mausoleum for forgotten childhoods. David was examining a section of the wall near the back when he misjudged the space, his elbow bumping a shelf. A small porcelain doll with blonde ringlets and a blue dress teetered for a moment before falling to the wooden floor with a sharp, echoing crack. It shattered into a dozen pieces. The sound broke the room's dead silence, and in the stillness that followed, something new began. A whisper. It was faint at first, like the sigh of wind through a keyhole, a dry, rustling sound that seemed to come from all around us. Shh. The whisper grew, coalescing into dozens, then hundreds of tiny, sibilant voices overlapping and indistinct, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. I scanned the shelves, my heart hammering against my ribs. The dolls' heads were moving, slowly, with a series of tiny, creaking sounds. They were turning on their little wooden and porcelain necks to follow us. The wooden fingers of the marionettes began to clench and unclench. The painted smiles on the clowns seemed to widen. Before we could react to this new horror, the door we had entered through exploded inward, torn from its hinges. The same gray werewolf from the mirror hall filled the doorway, its fur matted with Mark's blood. It let out a triumphant roar that shook the very shelves, its yellow eyes locking onto us. We were trapped. There was nowhere to run. But the werewolf was not the only hunter in the room. As its roar echoed, the whispering from the dolls rose to a single, high-pitched, unearthly shriek. It was a sound of immense collective rage. In a single horrifying moment, the silent audience came to life. They leaped and tumbled from the shelves, a cascading avalanche of porcelain, wood, and cloth. The marionette strings tangled and writhed like living snakes, propelling them through the air. The porcelain ladies scurried across the floor on their tiny, delicate feet with unnatural speed. The clowns tumbled end over end, their movements jerky and chaotic. They swarmed the werewolf. The creature, caught completely by surprise, roared in fury and confusion as the tiny army descended upon it. It was a surreal, grotesque battle. The porcelain dolls hammered at its legs with their rock-hard heads, the impacts creating sharp cracking sounds. The clowns, with a terrifying, silent ferocity, leaped onto its back, biting at its fur with mouths that should have been filled with stuffing, but seemed to tear at it nonetheless. The marionettes, their strings now a weapon, wrapped themselves around the beast's limbs and throat, pulling taut, their wooden bodies swinging wildly. The werewolf thrashed and snapped, seizing dolls in its massive jaws and crushing them to splinters. But for every one it destroyed, 10 more took its place. They were a relentless, chittering tide of pure malice. Watching their focused, hateful rage, I had a sudden, terrible realization. These weren't just enchanted toys. Valyrias had promised his victims eternity. This was it. The trapped, vengeful souls of children, of women, of men, all imprisoned within these tiny, smiling bodies. The werewolf, blinded and overwhelmed, let out a howl of pain as a porcelain doll shattered against its eye. It was completely distracted, consumed by the tiny, furious swarm. At the back of the room, a section of shelving swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow passage. The woman pointed, her face a mask of terror. This was our only escape. Grabbing David's arm, I pulled him toward the opening. We plunged into the darkness, the sounds of the monster's pained howls and the furious, shattering shrieks of the doll army fading behind us as we ran. The passage was tight, dark, and smelled of damp earth and decay. It twisted downward, the stone slick under our feet. We emerged, gasping for breath, into a space so vast and unexpected that my mind struggled to accept it. We were standing at the edge of a forest. A thick canopy of gnarled, leafless branches formed a ceiling high above. But instead of a sky, there was only oppressive, black stone. The only light came from strange phosphorescent fungi growing on the tree trunks and clusters of faintly glowing crystals embedded in the sky above, casting the entire cavern in a sickly, pale green and violet light. It was a monstrous parody of a forest, a nightmare ecosystem thriving in the belly of the castle. A new scent filled the air, thick and greasy. It was the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat. My stomach, despite the terror, clenched with a pang of primal hunger, a reaction that filled me with immediate self-loathing. The smell was rich and savory, but with a sweetish undertone that was deeply wrong. David and the woman, she'd finally managed to gasp out her name, Sarah, looked as ill as I felt. We had to keep moving. The howls of the werewolves might have faded, but we knew we were far from safe. We pushed our way through the twisted, grasping trees, the ground soft and spongy underfoot, like moss covering something rotten. The smell of the cooking fire grew stronger, guiding us. After a few hundred yards, we broke through the trees into a large clearing. In the center, a massive bonfire blazed, spitting sparks into the cavern's gloom. And squatting on either side of the fire were two of the most grotesque creatures I had ever seen. They were trolls, straight from the pages of a twisted fairy tale. Each was at least 10 feet tall, with thick, warty skin the color of granite. Their bodies were brutish masses of muscle and fat. their arms as thick as tree trunks, ending in grimy, sausage-like fingers. Their faces were squashed and porcine, with tiny, cruel eyes set deep above wide, flat noses. And they were cooking dinner. Spitted on a massive, makeshift rotisserie over the fire were 2 human bodies, stripped of their clothes, their skin blistering and blackening in the heat. It was 2 of the Japanese students I had seen in the village square. The 2 trolls were grumbling to each other in a guttural, wet-sounding language, occasionally prodding their meal with a long, sharpened stick, their wide mouths breaking into hideous, snaggle-toothed grins. Sarah let out a strangled gasp and clapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. We were frozen, hidden at the edge of the tree line, not daring to breathe. Just then, a familiar, terrifying sound cut through the air from the direction we'd come, a long hunting howl. It was answered by another, closer this time. They were on our trail again. New werewolves, or perhaps the old ones had regrouped. We were caught between 2 unimaginable horrors. Staying here meant waiting for the werewolves. Moving forward meant crossing that clearing in full view of the feasting trolls. "We have to go," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Around the edge. Stay in the shadows." It was a desperate, foolish plan, but it was the only one we had. We began to creep along the tree line, trying to circle the clearing. But the forest floor was littered with dry, brittle branches. Sarah, her nerves completely shot, stepped on one. It snapped with a crack that sounded like a rifle shot in the relative quiet of the cavern. Instantly, the 2 trolls stopped their chatter. Their massive heads swiveled in our direction, their tiny piggy eyes narrowing as they peered into the gloom. One of them let out a low, rumbling grunt and pointed a thick finger directly at us. We were seen. With a guttural roar, it heaved its massive frame to its feet and began to lumber toward us. Panic took over again. We turned and ran, breaking from the cover of the trees and sprinting across the clearing. The troll was surprisingly fast, its huge, flat feet pounding the ground, shaking the very earth beneath us. Behind us, the werewolves burst from the forest, their howls turning to excited yelps as they saw their prey in the open. The troll was closer. I could hear its heavy, wheezing breath, smell its foul, carrion stench. It reached out a massive, grubby hand and snatched David. He screamed as the huge fingers closed around his torso, lifting him effortlessly off the ground like a doll. I faltered, turning back, but there was nothing I could do. The troll held him up, examining him with a look of stupid curiosity before opening its cavernous mouth. At that exact moment, the lead werewolf, a huge black-furred beast, leaped into the clearing, its eyes fixed on me and Sarah. But the second troll, who had remained by the fire, saw it. Its brutish face split into a joyful, greedy grin. It let out a booming laugh and bellowed something in its horrible language. Then it bellowed in broken, heavily accented English, "More meat for fire, good hunt!" Ignoring us completely, the second troll charged the werewolf. The beast, so terrifying and invincible just moments before, looked almost small as the mountain of flesh and muscle slammed into it. The troll wrapped its immense arms around the werewolf, lifting it from the ground in a crushing bear hug. The werewolf snarled and snapped, its claws tearing uselessly at the troll's thick, leathery hide. Trapped in the monster's iron grip, it was helpless. The first troll, still holding a screaming David, was momentarily distracted by the fight. That was all the chance I had. With a heart tearing in my chest for the man I was leaving behind, I grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her along. "Run!" I screamed. We ran, leaving the cacophony behind us. David's screams, the werewolves' snarls, and the deep, booming laughter of the trolls who had just found an unexpected addition to their ghastly feast. We ran blindly through the grotesque forest, the sounds of the chaotic battle on the trolls' picnic ground fading behind us. I didn't dare look back. Adrenaline and sheer terror propelled me forward, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. Sarah was stumbling beside me, sobbing hysterically. The surreal landscape of glowing fungus and twisted trees seemed to stretch on forever. I was focused only on the ground in front of me, watching for roots and rocks, when suddenly the spongy earth beneath my feet gave way. There was no warning, just a sickening lurch as a section of the forest floor, a cleverly disguised trapdoor of rotten wood and moss, collapsed. With a cry of alarm, I plunged into the darkness below. My descent was short and was broken by a surprisingly soft, if unpleasant, landing. I hit a massive pile of damp, foul-smelling fabric that cushioned my fall. It took me a moment to get my bearings, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had fallen perhaps 15 feet into a vast, steam-filled chamber. I pushed myself up, my hands sinking into the disgusting wet heap. It was clothing. Piles and mountains of it. I was in some kind of colossal subterranean laundry room. The chamber was carved from wet, dripping stone, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew, lye, and something metallic and coppery that I knew instinctively was old blood. Along the walls were enormous stone vats, each the size of a small car, filled with murky, bubbling water heated by fires burning in grates beneath them. And working at these vats were the laundresses. They were gargoyles. Not the stone statues, but living, breathing creatures. Each stood about 5 feet tall, with tough, slate-gray skin, hunched backs, and powerful arms. Leathery bat-like wings were folded tight against their spines, and their ugly, squashed faces were fixed in expressions of perpetual discontent. There were 3 of them, and they were hard at work, scrubbing and wringing out clothes with grim determination, using stiff bristled brushes and harsh blocks of soap. They were complaining. Their voices were like grinding stones, gravelly and perpetually annoyed. "More blood," one of them rasped, holding up a nobleman's frilled shirt, now stained a stubborn brown. "I swear the wolves are getting sloppier." You'd think after a few centuries they'd learn to go for the throat cleanly. But no, they have to play with their food. These damask silks are a nightmare to get clean. "Tell me about it," another grumbled from a nearby vat, furiously scrubbing a woman's velvet dress. "And what about the trolls?" "Last week I spent 2 days trying to get roasted fat and scorch marks out of a whole set of livery. Why can't the master just give them aprons?" "It's the principle of the thing," the third one chimed in, hoisting a heavy load of wet trousers from a vat and slapping them onto a stone table. "No respect for the laundry staff, none at all. We're the ones who have to maintain the standards of this household, and do we get any thanks? No, just more stains." I crouched behind the mountain of dirty clothes, my body rigid with a new kind of fear. This was the castle's laundry. This was where the clothes of the victims ended up. I was hiding in a pile of evidence from countless massacres. The gargoyles were so completely absorbed in their menial labor and their timeless, bitter complaints that they hadn't heard me fall. My sudden appearance would, I was certain, be seen as just another chore to be dealt with. My eyes darted around the steamy chamber, searching for an escape route. I had to get out of here before I was noticed. Moving with agonizing slowness, I began to creep away from the central pile, using the giant vats and overflowing wicker baskets of soiled linen as cover. The air was hot and suffocatingly humid. The rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape of their brushes and their constant whining commentary filled the room. "And another thing," the first one griped, "the new guests. All these synthetic fabrics, they just fall apart in the hot water. Give me a good sturdy cotton or wool any day. I pressed myself flat against the cold, damp stone wall, inching my way toward the far corner of the chamber. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. Every little scrape of my boot on the floor sounded like an explosion to my own ears. Finally, I saw it. Tucked away in a dark, shadowed alcove, almost completely hidden behind a stack of rusted drying racks, was a narrow, wrought-iron spiral staircase leading up into blackness. It was my only way out. Taking a deep breath, I made a final silent dash for it, my feet whispering across the flagstones. I reached the base of the staircase without being seen. The gargoyles were now arguing about the best way to remove a particularly stubborn wine stain. Holding my breath, I began to climb, placing each foot with surgical precision on the cold iron steps to avoid making them creak. Up and up I went into the darkness, leaving the infernal laundry and its bickering caretakers below. The staircase ended at a heavy wooden trap door. I pushed it open slowly, poked my head through, and found myself in a dark, silent space thick with the smell of dust and decay. I had made it to the castle's attic. The attic was a graveyard of forgotten things. A vast, low-ceilinged space stretched out under the castle's massive rafters, cluttered with the detritus of centuries. Ghostly shapes of furniture draped in white dust cloths stood like silent mourners. Broken statues, stacks of peeling paintings, and chests bound in rusted iron were scattered everywhere. A thick carpet of gray dust covered everything, muffling my footsteps. The only light came from thin slivers of moonlight piercing through gaps in the roof slates, illuminating swirling motes of dust in the still air. I moved cautiously, every creak of the floorboards under my weight sounding like a thunderclap in the oppressive silence. I was terrified that any sound would give away my position to whatever hunted below. As I navigated the maze of discarded history, I noticed a faint, rectangular line of light on the floor ahead. It was coming from a crack between the floorboards. Curiosity, perhaps a foolish, self-destructive kind, got the better of me. The need to understand what this place was, what these creatures wanted, was overwhelming. On my hands and knees, I crawled toward the light, my movements slow and deliberate until I was directly over it. I lowered my head and pressed my eye to the narrow gap. I was looking down into a lavishly appointed study. The room was paneled in dark, polished wood, with a massive stone fireplace at one end, where a low fire crackled. A huge desk carved from a single piece of oak dominated the center of the room, and seated around it, as if in a corporate board meeting from hell, were Lord Valyrias and his inner circle. Valyrias himself sat in a high-backed, throne-like chair. The hulking, wolf-headed creature and the slender, winged monster stood behind him like demonic bodyguards. Seated at the table were the tentacled thing and the major domo, who looked as unnervingly calm and collected as ever. They were talking, their voices drifting up to me through the floorboards. The wolf creature spoke first, its voice a low, impatient growl. "My lord, the hunt is nearly done. The last of the prey are cornered or consumed. The hour grows late. Will you not permit us to join the final feast?" Valyrias raised a hand, silencing him. His own voice, when he spoke, was calm and laced with a cold, intellectual weariness. "Patience, Fenris. This is not mere sport, as you well know. It is a ritual, a necessary sacrifice." He gestured vaguely at the air around him. "The fear of the quarry, the spilling of their life force upon the castle stones, it all serves a purpose. It weakens the seal. It nourishes the enchantment that holds us here. My blood turned to ice. A seal. This castle wasn't their fortress. It was their prison. The winged creature spoke next, its voice a high, whispering hiss like dry leaves blowing across pavement. "And the final piece, Master? Is the energy sufficient this time?" "It is close," Valyrias replied, steepling his long, pale fingers. "This was a good harvest. So much terror. So much desperation. It has fed the ritual well. When the final life is extinguished at the appointed hour, the last threads of the ancient binding will unravel. After centuries of confinement, we will finally be able to walk in the mortal world again. The feast can wait. A world of mortals awaits us outside these walls." I stifled a gasp, pressing my hand to my mouth. This whole night, this entire festival of slaughter was a complex, arcane ritual designed to unleash these monsters upon the world. They weren't just killing for sport. They were using our deaths as fuel to break out of their cage. "The dawn of the second day approaches," the majordomo said, his voice flat and businesslike. "All accounted for." Valyrias nodded slowly. "The trolls have their share. The pack has feasted. The dolls have claimed a hunter, a small but acceptable loss. The last two, the man and the woman, were separated in the forest. She fell into the gorge. The majordomo paused. "He seems to have vanished, my lord. The pack lost his scent near the laundry. It is likely he fell into one of the lower chasms. He is presumed dead." Relief, cold and sharp, flooded through me. They thought I was dead. They weren't looking for me. Valyrias was silent for a long moment. He stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his intelligent, monstrous eyes. Then he slowly shook his head. "No," he said softly, the word cutting through the room's stillness. "Not dead. Misplaced." He sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. "There is still one small rat, skittering about in the walls of my house." He fell silent again. Then, with a speed that defied nature, he tilted his head back and lifted his gaze. His burning, inhuman eyes staring directly upward, directly at the crack in the floor, directly into my own terrified eye. He saw me. "And I believe," he whispered, a predatory smile twisting his ruined face, "I have found him." In that instant, the floorboards beneath me, ancient and dry, gave way with a deafening, explosive crack. My desperate grip on the neighboring planks was useless. With a cry of pure terror, I fell through the splintered wood and dust, tumbling through the air and crashing down onto the great oak desk, right in the center of the Council of Monsters. I landed hard on the polished surface of the desk, scattering parchments and knocking over a heavy silver inkwell. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and for a second I lay there, dazed and bruised, staring up at the splintered hole in the ceiling from which I had just fallen. Then reality crashed back in. I was surrounded. Fenris, the wolf monster, let out a rumbling snarl, his red eyes burning with hunger as he took a step forward. The winged creature unfolded its shadowy wings slightly, a gesture of imminent attack. The thing with the tentacles slithered around the edge of the desk, its appendages writhing with anticipation. I scrambled backward, falling off the desk and onto the floor, expecting claws and teeth and a swift, brutal end. My life, which I had fought for so desperately all night, was over in a moment of stupid, careless curiosity. "Enough," a voice commanded. The single word, spoken with quiet, absolute authority by Lord Valyrias, froze the monsters in place. He rose from his throne-like chair and walked slowly around the desk to where I lay sprawled on the floor. He looked down at me, not with rage, but with a strange, analytical curiosity, like a scientist examining an unusual specimen. "Do not touch him," Valyrias said to his retinue. his gaze never leaving my face. He is the one. He is the victor. I stared up at him, confused, my mind reeling. Victor? I croaked. But of course, Valyrias said, a dry chuckle escaping his lipless mouth. The 24 hours have passed. The sun has begun its second journey since you entered my domain. You are the last one. You have survived the great hunt. He turned to his monstrous servants. I am a man of my word. I made a promise, and I always, always keep it. He gestured to Fenris and the winged creature. Take him to the sanctum. The two monsters grabbed my arms, their grip surprisingly gentle, yet inescapably strong. They lifted me to my feet and began to lead me from the study. I didn't struggle. I was too exhausted, too bewildered to resist. They guided me through more dark corridors, past chambers from which I could hear the sounds of feasting and guttural growls, until we arrived before a pair of immense black stone doors carved with writhing demonic figures. The doors swung open on their own, revealing a vast circular chamber that looked like a temple to some forgotten evil god. The air inside was cold and heavy. The ceiling was a high, domed vault, and the walls were smooth, featureless black obsidian. In the very center of the chamber, a colossal statue rose from the floor. It was a 20-foot-tall depiction of a winged demon, carved from the same black stone, its face a mask of serene cruelty. A faint, blood-red mist, thick as smoke, swirled lazily around the base of the statue, pulsing with a faint inner light. My monstrous escorts forced me to my knees before the statue. Lord Valyrias entered the chamber behind us, walking with a slow, purposeful stride until he stood before the altar at the statue's feet. He began to chant, his voice low and resonant, speaking in a language so ancient and guttural that it hurt my ears to listen to. The words were filled with power, and as he spoke, the chamber began to change. The red mist around the statue stirred, then began to writhe and hiss like a living thing. The statue itself started to glow from within, faint red lines appearing all over its surface like a network of veins. The chanting grew louder, more frantic. Then, with a sound like a great inrush of breath, the entire cloud of red mist surged away from the statue and shot across the room, slamming into Lord Valyrias. He cried out, a sound of both agony and ecstasy, and fell to his knees. His hideous, malformed body began to convulse. Bones snapped and reset. His waxy, ruined skin seemed to melt away, revealing new, healthy flesh beneath. The grotesque asymmetry of his face smoothed out, the ridges of bone receding, the sneer softening into a perfectly formed mouth. In the space of 30 seconds, the monster was gone. Kneeling where he had fallen was a man. He was impossibly handsome, with the chiseled features of a fallen angel, high cheekbones, and a cascade of dark hair. He rose to his feet, no longer hunched but standing tall and proud, the picture of aristocratic perfection. Only his eyes remained the same, ancient, intelligent, and utterly merciless. His monstrous servants bowed their heads in reverence. The curse was broken. He turned his perfect face toward me, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his lips. "The prison is open," he said, his voice now a smooth, velvety baritone. "The ritual is complete. And now, Victor, for your gift." He crossed the space between us in a silent, fluid movement. He stood over me, a figure of terrible, dark beauty. An invisible force lifted me to my feet, holding me paralyzed before him. "You have earned your eternity," he whispered. He opened his mouth, and for the first time, I saw his teeth clearly. Two of them, his canines, were elongated into sharp, needle-like points. Fangs. He wasn't a monster of twisted flesh anymore. He was something older, purer, a vampire. With a final devilish smile, he leaned forward and sank his fangs deep into the side of my neck. I awoke with a gasp, the scent of pine needles and damp earth filling my nostrils. I was lying on a bed of moss at the foot of the Carpathian Mountains, the forest canopy a dense green ceiling high above me. My body ached as if I'd been trampled by horses. I sat up, my head pounding. I looked around wildly. The castle, the jagged black spire that had dominated the sky, was gone. The winding path that led up to it was gone. There was no sign that it, or the impossible village, had ever existed. It was just me and the ancient silent forest. A wave of dizzying relief washed over me. It was a dream. A nightmare, brought on by exhaustion, dehydration, and the strange hypnotic power of the Romanian wilderness. My historian's mind supplied a dozen plausible explanations. A fever dream, a minor concussion from a fall I didn't remember. I laughed, a shaky, weak sound. Just a dream. I tried to get to my feet, and the world tilted violently. A strange weakness pervaded my limbs, yet at the same time my senses felt sharp, unnaturally so. I could hear the frantic, tiny heartbeat of a field mouse scurrying beneath the roots of a nearby oak. I could smell the faint coppery tang of blood from a small scratch on the back of my hand, a scent that was suddenly, powerfully alluring. A deep, gnawing thirst clawed at my throat, a thirst unlike any I had ever known. It wasn't for water. Panic began to edge out my relief. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. I touched my neck, where the phantom memory of fangs still burned. My fingers found two small, deep puncture wounds, already scabbed over but undeniably there. My tongue, thick and dry in my mouth, darted out to wet my lips and brushed against my own teeth. I froze. My canines felt different, longer, sharper. I ran my tongue over them again, a frantic, disbelieving exploration. They were fangs. Two unnaturally long, needle-sharp points where my normal teeth should be. The horror crashed down on me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't a dream. Valyrias, the hunt, the gift. It was all real. Just then, the first rays of the morning sun broke over the distant mountain peaks. A single golden shaft of light pierced through a gap in the leaves and touched my outstretched hand. Pain, absolute and unimaginable, exploded through me. It was not the heat of a burn. It was 1,000 times worse, a searing holy fire that felt like it was atomizing my very cells. I screamed a raw, agonized sound and scrambled backward, crab walking desperately away from the light, back into the deepest shadows of the forest. The patch of skin the light had touched was red and blistered as if I had pressed a hot iron to it. I huddled at the base of a massive beech tree, my body shaking uncontrollably, staring at the encroaching daylight with a new and profound terror. The sun. The beautiful, life-giving sun, the symbol of hope and salvation for every lost soul in every story ever told, was now my deadliest enemy. It was a relentless, celestial hunter that would boil the very blood in my veins. I was trapped. I had survived the night only to be condemned by the day. As I sat there in the shadows, tormented and afraid, the thirst raged within me, a burning, undeniable craving. I was weak, so terribly weak. I needed to feed. The promise of eternity had been fulfilled. I was a victor of the great hunt. I had received the gift of Lord Valyrias. My new life, a cursed, endless existence of darkness, solitude, and a monstrous, insatiable hunger had just begun. I didn't know what I would do or where I would go. But as I listened to the forest waking around me, to the heartbeats of the small, warm-blooded creatures that were now my only source of sustenance, I understood one terrible truth with chilling clarity. The hunt was not over. It would never be over. Now I was the hunter.